Thank you very much, Chris. I just want to ask you, in your capacity as part of the real estate development industry, can you say that you don't need money from the TARP? Or okay. But anyway, okay. Okay, I want to thank our panelists and open it up to questions at this point. As the moderator, I want to take the prerogative of asking the first question. One thing that appears from what we've heard today is that the future of the U.S. Probably does not belong as much in suburban growth as it has and belongs more in urban growth. But yet the developers have often chosen to build in the exurbs, and one reason that is often cited is that it's simply easier to do it out there. You don't have all the participants, the oversight, and so forth. Is there any role for the federal government in trying to kind of move more towards an urban model of growth as opposed to an ex-urban one?
This is near and dear to my heart. There's a project, a new urbanist high-density project that we are just finishing up outside of Philadelphia. It's a small project, 120 units, high density, relatively high density, 6 times as dense as the neighborhood around it. We had, for a fluke of a lawsuit filed against this jurisdiction 25 years ago by a civil rights group, by a fluke, we happened to have the zoning to allow us to do it. So we weren't going into this jurisdiction to ask for a 6 times increase in the density. It was already there. It took us 7 years of torturous brain damage to get that building, or to get that project moving. And it is, by the way, the fastest growing, even in this miserable market, or fastest selling real estate project in the Philadelphia region. It cost us millions of dollars. What I think the feds can do is, with the transportation investment, a requirement is, around the stations, you must engage in what I mentioned earlier, overlay zoning districts, to take advantage of the infrastructure that is being built. Another friend of mine outside of Philadelphia, who's on the steering committee of an organization I've founded of the progressive developers in this country, and we're lobbying for, we're part of the Transportation for America Coalition, lobbying for the transportation bill and for the economic recovery bill. He had a project on the main line at a train station to rebuild the train station and develop high-density product all around it on a surface parking lot. So it's not as if he was replacing any buildings. He was getting death threats from the blue-haired ladies on the main line if he was going to go forward with that project. Death threats. Now, he didn't take them seriously, but the point is that we need to encourage high-density development around these stations. And if the federal government's going to put money in, there must be ways for that investment to result in high-density, mixed-use, walkable development around it. So that's one way.
Okay, thanks. Yes, Bob.
In the interest of full disclosure, I should note that I work in the commercial real estate industry and also advise people who are doing transit-oriented development projects. But one of the things I wanted to say, and it goes back to the question that the woman from Skadden Arps asked, is that I think that the federal government could, to help encourage this kind of growth, make some transportation funding available to help fund transit-oriented development projects around transit lines. One of the problems we have in funding mass transit, I'm going to go away from what I said before, which is that to some extent we can fund walkable districts and not have to think about any kind of transit, but people still need to go from place to place. But one of the things that we have is when the Department of Transportation reviews mass transit projects, whether light rail or heavy rail, they make a forecast of demand. And I think our experience is that the demand forecasts tend to be somewhat static rather than dynamic, by which I mean that they take a look at how many people live along the rail line now, they take a very conservative estimate of how many people are likely to live along it later, and they underestimate, or they misunderestimate, as the phrase probably goes, how many people will live along that line. Some part of transportation funding, that's why I talked about land use, needs to help work out those kinds of structures and give an incentive for people to build walkable, transit-oriented developments around the transit stations. The one thing that we know, and I spent time up here and I've worked in local government, is that we will never get the federal government in a stimulus program or anything else to tell a state what to do, or a city rather, what to do about its zoning, how to zone a certain area. We could, however, say that if you want this transportation funding, you're going to have to make easy to do the kinds of developments that go hand in hand with that kind of funding so that we maximize the investment which we put into those structures.
Okay, thank you. So let's open it up now to questions. Yes. Yes, great.
I tell you, I think we have to talk about, sort of take this, straight on. There is a need for taking the funding, that things can't be based just on pay-as-you-go in the transportation system. There needs to be a distribution mechanism that says that people who don't have access to certain kinds of jobs or transportation or housing as other people do, get the benefit of the wealth creation that goes on in the other areas. So, and let me give you an example. Let me go back to the example I gave before. If you take a look at whether you can run a transit line out to a not so densely built up community, and you only make that the criterion, you're not going to send a transit line out to a less affluent community that was built, say, 30, 40 years ago, of people who live in single-family homes. Even if they're relatively close together, it won't be justified. We've got to have some kind of rule that says that those people aren't also going to be able to buy a car every couple of years, and they need access to transportation. In terms of mass transit, one of the things that we need to bite the bullet on, we all know this, there are no mass transit systems in the world that pay as they go, that get their money just from the fare box. New York City comes as close as any, and I think it's something like 65%. They're all subsidized. The ones in Europe that we all sort of love to talk about, because the train comes every 3 minutes or the bus comes every 30 seconds, it seems like, are subsidized. And that's, I think, it's something that we really need to agree with, need to talk about.
Did you say that you were with Zach Wamp? Space, I'm sorry, because I know Zach Wamp and I know Chattanooga is one of my favorite towns on the planet. I've done a lot of work down there. The issue needs to be divided into two answers. And let me answer the question you didn't ask, but it's always asked, which is, given the fact that walkable urban places, there's pent-up demand for it, the result is that the walkable urban places that exist are the most expensive places in the region. And as I mentioned earlier, this has only happened in the last 20 years. The ultimate answer to it is more supply. We need more supply to drive down the price. There's no reason that townhouse in DuPont Circle should cost $600 a square foot. Half of the reason it costs that much is because of the dirt underneath of it. And there's a limit to how much dirt there is, because there's a limit to how many walkable urban places there are. So if we add more supply, the prices will come down. The reason is a shortage of supply and pent-up demand, which drives prices up. The other thing that we're going to do, or that we see happening, in this country, drivable suburban households spend 25% of their household income on transportation. 25%. The average for the country is 19%, but for the people that live in car-dependent households, it's 25%. Many times it's up to 40%. So there are people in this country that own a car to drive to work so they can afford to own a car to drive to work. It's not a great way to create wealth. Walkable urban households spend 9% of their household income on transportation. It's a 16% delta that if we could shift that into housing, into education, or into that totally un-American thing, savings, that's a lot of money that you're talking about. And so that's the ultimate affordable housing solution that applies across the board. As far as the rural question, first we have to recognize that in this country, 80% of us live in metropolitan areas that create 90% of the GDP. This is a metropolitan nation, and we have to invest where the money is being made, where the economy is growing. So what that means is that the rural solutions are going to have to be, just as Don said, have to be viewed as subsidies, and they're not going to be mass transit. They could be van pools and that kind of a thing for the elderly to get to health care and to their services that are required. But it's a different solution than the metropolitan solution. The metropolitan solution is transit, biking, walking. The rural solutions will be road-based, and they're going to have to be subsidized. But the money to subsidize it is going to come from the metropolitan areas. That's where the money's made in this country. And we had better invest in that part of our country if we ever want to have the money to subsidize the rural economies.
And I would just add that the rural economy and also the rural mode of living is one that is very green friendly. It's really the sprawl in between the urban and the rural that creates a disproportionate amount of greenhouse gases and so forth. So you see much less sprawl in places like Europe where you go directly from urban to rural. Next question. Yes. If I might just comment on that, there is a real question, and both Bob and Chris alluded to the fact that there is federal jurisdiction, there's state and local jurisdiction, and for many of these issues, the impact or the footprint of the federal government is not necessarily that great. For example, on local zoning issues. So really, we probably have to talk about changing the mindset of the consumer. But let me see who else would like to take that one.
First, I'd say just as Chris was saying, that the mindset of the consumer is changing with respect to where people live. I think it's changing with respect to demands for energy efficiency and housing. Second, there are a lot of local jurisdictions that are now adopting green building codes. So no matter what you do, whether it's any kind of a development over a certain amount of money in the commercial industry, for example, in Washington, D.C. now, any building over a certain size by a certain year is going to have a certain LEED or other equivalent kind of a measuring mechanism attached to it. So I think you're going to see that coming. There are opportunities. Clearly, people have the energy utilities have been so loath because of the cost of adding new capacity, that we have a utility system in which people are paid by the utilities not to generate more demand. There are cases in which you can get the utility to share the cost of weatherizing your house or upgrading to a more efficient boiler. So there are a lot of things sort of coming together to make that happen. one other thing I just say, and this sort of goes to that other issue I just wanted to throw out on the table, is that in terms of what the federal government can do, there is a need to think more holistically. You know, EPA sometimes is over here thinking about water and sewer, and transportation's thinking about transportation, and we don't have a mechanism so far. Maybe Carol Browner will provide it in the White House to think about those things together, and how do we create a kind of an incentive and mechanism for communities and states to think about those things. But again, I'll say I think some of those things you're talking about are starting to come together. And Chris.
Next question. I think we have time for, say, 3 more questions. I would just say quickly that that's a very interesting proposal, and certainly some sort of a model code, and there are in fact model codes, might accomplish some of the same goals as an actual federal mandate. I just want to mention one other thing before I turn it over to our panelists. There has been some very interesting discussion in terms of financing vehicles for housing. For example, mortgages. Having a provision whereby you would have a kind of a cookie cutter means of financing these types of efficiency changes. And some of that stuff could perhaps be addressed nationally at the federal level by things that have a national impact, such as mortgaging language or particularly federally guaranteed mortgages. But let me turn it over to our experts.
Over the next year or two, real estate finance and real estate in general will be dealing with the tsunami of loan repricing. The next wave to hit is going to be massive foreclosures in the commercial property sector. So they're not going to be focusing on this. But once we get through that, once we reprice, and a lot of people feel a lot of pain, I believe the market's going to get there anyway. I don't think, and particularly on the commercial side, I've been on the board of a green investment fund in real estate, and the fund won't touch anything that's not LEED certified. And I think that's becoming the standard for most investment funds, or will be the standard very quickly over the next few years after we get through this mess. On the residential side, that's a different story, because many times homeowners are willing to sacrifice long-term savings for short-term lower cost. So I would love to find a way that we can, to me, the government, whether it be federal or state or local, to me, it's about building a corral. And you don't let people outside the corral, but inside the corral, it's a free market. And I think the corral for the residential market should be that homes should achieve a certain energy level, and that's just the law. And so that we don't see, we just don't give consumers the option. It's sort of like seat belts. We don't give you the option not to have seat belts, and it's illegal to drive without your seat belt on. It's illegal to drive without a helmet if you're driving a motorcycle. It's a similar thing. We know it's cheaper if we build green. It only increases your cost by 2, 3, 4%, and it saves you money yearly from there on. I think there's national security reasons to do it. There's obviously greenhouse gas reasons to do it, and I think it's on the residential side that we're going to have to look at that. I think on the commercial side, the market may take care of it itself.
Other questions? Yes. Just two quick comments on the first on your first point. There should be a natural gradient between where jobs are located and where you live, such that if you live further away from your job, you should pay less for your housing to compensate for transportation. You're absolutely right. That's not recognized by mortgages, and I don't know that there are any great proposals out there, but it should be an area for further thought. Secondly, we at NDN have a proposal to green the federal government, and clearly putting things like transport-oriented development into the overall plan for the space needs of the U.S. government should be a part of that. I understand that there is going to be quite a lot of fairly aggressive set of executive orders coming out of the administration in this area, and we're hopeful that many of these things will be addressed.
First of all, I would just note that NIH was not under GSA's jurisdiction, so I couldn't influence the campus. But I'll give you a counterpoint and then a more general point. Let me just answer your federal question. I let Chris talk a little bit more if he cares to about how mortgages are underwritten and whether we can get the transportation costs considered. But you are right. There have been, since at least the Carter administration, executive orders that require federal agencies to locate downtown or in urban areas. They are honored, to be perfectly honest, neither GSA nor anyone in the federal government seems to have the power actually to make that happen as much as it might, because heads of federal agencies generally have greater influence than anybody else about where their agencies go, and they tend to, like private sector CEOs, often determine their location by proximity to where they live rather than to where a metropolitan area might want people to go. But I'll give you a counter example that makes your point. The Southeast Federal Center, now being redeveloped, was at one time planned as a federal office campus. And one of the things that we did at GSA with great support from Congresswoman Norton was to turn it into a mixed-use public-private development where people will live, shop, and using the Department of Transportation as an anchor development have helped sort of turn that into a place. And I think that's the sort of thing that needs to happen. I hope that, quite honestly, the same thing can happen if the Department of Homeland Security is, in fact, going up to St. Elizabeth's, where it also needs to be an urbanized environment to take great advantage of that. One other point I'll just make is that I know we've turned a lot of this transportation on its head into a discussion of real estate development. But one of the things that Senator Moynihan taught me was that there was a huge difference in this country over the issue of air pollution when we were able to figure out a way to measure it. When you could pick up the phone, call the weather, and every day they told you that the air pollution index was 92. They used to do this, remember, or 95, and we have red alerts and all that. It made a difference. Every day you could measure whether you're getting better or worse, and an index counts. The LEED, Green Globe, and other kinds of measures we're getting for building sustainability and greenness are also important because they allow people to have some sense. They're generally flexible and allow you to use different initiatives. The one thing I'd say that those measures are just getting into are measures of location and transportation and whether they generate transportation or not. That's a very important issue for all of us in creating the kind of environment we're talking about.
Bob, one of my research projects at Brookings is to create a measurable way of measuring the market viability and the social equity of walkable urban places, because we do need, if we don't measure it, we can't figure out if we're doing the right thing. As far as the mortgage, we obviously have a great example that has floundered in the last few years because Fannie Mae was attempting to put it in place, and that's the location-efficient mortgage. Scott Bernstein, the Neighborhood Technology Center out in Chicago, developed it, and it does provide more flexibility for Fannie Mae to exceed their limits of family income that can go into a mortgage if you live near a transit or a bus line. And so we do have we have 5 or 6 years worth of examples in Chicago, Los Angeles, and I forget where it was back east, where Fannie Mae tried this, but we absolutely need that. And just so you know the power of this, you know, shifting that 16% of household income, let me make it more graphic for you. That in 2007, the average car, according to the AAA, to own and operate cost $7,800 per year. That's a Camry, or Focus, hopefully, driving at 15,000 miles per year. That $7,800 per year translates at a 6% mortgage rate, and today mortgage rates are down to 5%. At a 6% mortgage rate, that translates into $150,000 worth of mortgage if you drop that car out of your household. It's a huge factor. It's because of the tax deductibility of a mortgage interest, and it's just, you know, leveraging it over a 30-year loan. And so shifting that 16% not only creates a more green environment, it also shifts your spending from an absolutely depreciable asset to, hopefully, an appreciable asset, your home. And that's the way to build wealth in this country. I mean, that's the first thing to do to build wealth for households, is to have them own their home. And the best way to do it is to use that 16%, but we need to allow. And by the way, going back to your second question about the GSA and the government, you know, the government has tremendous resources that they could take advantage of. My development firm attempted a joint venture with NASA out in the Bay Area at Moffett Field. Moffett Field is about 200 acres on the bay, 2 exits of the Bayshore Freeway, the 101 freeway, and 2 transit stops coming out of San Jose from the light rail. And all these high-powered scientists working for NASA, including my favorite guy, who was, by the way, the director of space. He said, you know, I start daydreaming and planets start falling out of the sky. It's a very important job. And here these folks on government salaries have to commute 2 and 3 hours a day because they can't live in the Mid-Peninsula. And they have 200 acres of underused land that could be converted into a mixed-use project where they could walk to work and have great discussions with their colleagues going back and forth from work. So those campuses are great resources as well.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming and attending our event. This has certainly been a good learning experience for me, and I think for all of us here. Indiana is going to be holding more events on the subject of clean infrastructure as we go forward, on the stimulus and on the transportation bill, which is likely to occur this year. So we hope to stay engaged with all of you, and thank you again for coming. Thank you to our panelists as well.
Thank you. I'm sorry. It's your fault.